Prospector, Native American salmon fishing. From the Prospector. Howdy, prospectors. This month my best friend, my mule, tried to convince me to write an entire issue on food. Seeing as though the critter is always hungry, he thought it was a good idea. We can write about hay and apples and alfalfa, he said. Everyone likes to read about alfalfa. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I've never been too interested in alfalfa, especially at the dinner table. But my mule's idea got me thinking, is there a food that is really important to Idaho history? Is there something tastier than hay that goes back to the early days of the Native Americans? After a little thinking, it came to me. Salmon. Even though my mule's not too fond of fish, he agreed, if you want to know about the history of Native Americans in Idaho, you have to know a little about salmon fishing. The first residents of Idaho were the Native Americans. Long before the Oregon Trail pioneers came through in their wagons, before the fur traders roamed the mountains in search of beaver pelts, even before Lewis and Clark passed through on their way to the ocean, Native Americans had settled the land. There were 7 distinct cultures or tribes in Idaho. In the north lived the Kootenai, Kalispel, and Coeur d'Alene. In the central region lived the Nez Perce, and in the south were the Shoshone, the Bannock, and the Northern Paiute. Although each tribe was unique, they all had one thing in common. All of the Indians in Idaho relied on salmon fishing to survive. Salmon are anadromous. Anadromous fish are born in fresh water like a lake or stream. Later, when they are about 1 year old, they follow rivers to the ocean where they grow and develop. After a few years in salt water, the salmon return to the rivers, swimming hundreds of miles to lay eggs in the very area where they had hatched. The main waterway into Idaho is the Columbia River. Fish swam up the Columbia every spring and summer and continued to connecting rivers like the Snake, Salmon, and Clearwater. In the 1800s, an estimated 10 to 16 million salmon filled the Columbia River network. When the fish arrived, some parts of the river were nothing but a teeming mass of scales and fins. There are several different types of salmon, but the most important species was the Chinook, also known as king salmon. Chinook salmon are huge. They are the largest salmon in the Pacific Ocean. In Alaska, some have even been caught that weigh over 90 pounds. When the Chinooks swam up the Columbia, the Indians of Idaho had a great food source. In most tribes, the men were the fishermen. Women also helped with the salmon harvest, but their job was to dry and store the fish. There were many methods the Indians used to catch salmon. One of the most common ways to fish was with a spear or harpoon. Spears are long wooden shafts with a fixed point at the end. These points could be simple sharp tips made of bone or wood, or elaborate constructions with 3 barbs that looked like giant forks. A spear fisherman waited patiently on a rock in the river and quickly stabbed at a passing fish. He never let go of his spear, so he could only hunt fish that swam close by. Most harpoons look like spears, but the point was detachable. Another difference was that a rope connected the point to the shaft. When a fisherman stabbed a fish, the point stuck in the animal but slid off the shaft. As the fish tried to swim away, it was stopped by the rope that still connected the harpoon tip to the long shaft. The fisherman could then pull in the fish, much in the same way as a modern fisherman reels in a fishing line. Indian fishermen also used large nets made of plant fibers. When the rivers were full of returning salmon, a fisherman could simply dip the net into water and wait for the salmon to swim in. In other areas, large traps made of rock and wood called weirs were built. Once they were built, weirs could do most of the fishermen's work for them, while they simply waited for the traps to fill. Once the fish were caught, they had to be preserved so that they would last into the winter. The simplest method of preservation was drying. To dry a fish, it was first cleaned and split into thin sections. These sections were left outside on racks, where the hot sun would burn away all of the moisture and turn the fish into a tough, long-lasting piece of jerky. Another way to preserve the fish was to smoke them. In this method, fish were put into a small building with a slow-burning, smoky fire. The heat and smoke would dry out the fish, making it ready for winter storage. In the past, the Indians of Idaho relied on the salmon for survival. Unfortunately, most of the great salmon runs have disappeared. Changes to the environment, like building great dams across the rivers, have made it difficult for large numbers of fish to return to our state. Many of the Idaho tribes are fighting for changes in our laws so that one day conditions might be favorable for the salmon to return. This page goes on to tell a little bit more about the weirs. You can see in the picture below, it's showing a dam of logs attached to a basket trap. One of the methods Native Americans used to catch fish was to build weirs. Weirs are fences that were built in streams and rivers to trap fish. These clever traps could be used to harvest large numbers of salmon when the rivers were filled with the spawning fish. There are many different kinds of weirs, but most of them worked in the same way. Built of rocks, sticks, or logs, most weirs consist of a long wall or dam that blocks the salmon and forces them to swim to a certain point in the river. Some weirs were shaped like the letter V and would stretch from bank to bank. The salmon who were trying to swim upriver would enter the open end of the V and be forced by the walls to swim toward the narrow point. At this tight junction, the Native Americans left an opening for the helpless fish to swim through. This hole was actually the mouth of a basket, cage, or small walled pool. The fish could easily swim in, but once inside, they had a difficult time getting out because of the tiny exit. Later, the trapped fish would be lifted out, cleaned, and prepared for the hungry tribe.